The maid, in the silence of the house, found a crying baby and soothed it with affection. But when the father saw the scene, everything changed forever. If you like love and romance stories, subscribe to this channel. Leave your comment. Every day we post videos like this one. Stay tuned. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at Port Authority, and Sarah Chen stepped off into the suffocating embrace of New York City. 23 years old, carrying everything she owned in a worn duffel bag and a backpack that had seen better days, she stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. The sounds, the smells, the endless sea of people rushing past her like she was invisible. Back in Cedar Falls, Iowa, everyone knew everyone. Here, she was nobody, and maybe that was exactly what she needed. Sarah had left home with nothing but a bus ticket, and the kind of determination that comes from having nowhere else to go. Her childhood had been a patchwork of foster homes and temporary families, each one teaching her the same harsh lesson over and over again. Don't get too comfortable. Don't expect to stay. And whatever you do, don't let anyone see how much it hurts when they send you away. By 18, she'd aged out of the system with a high school diploma, a part-time job at the local diner, and dreams that felt too big for a small town that had never really wanted her anyway. She'd saved every penny for 3 years, living in a studio apartment above the hardware store, working double shifts, eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, all so she could make this leap. New York City, the place where dreams came true, where nobodies became somebodies, where maybe, just maybe, she could find the life that had always felt just out of reach. But standing there in the terminal, watching families reunite and business people stride past with purpose, Sarah felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle in her chest. She pulled out her phone and looked at the address she'd written down. Mrs. Rodriguez from the cleaning service had promised her work, cash under the table, flexible hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start, and Sarah had learned long ago that you build a life one small brick at a time. The first few weeks were brutal. Sarah rented a room in Queens from a woman who spoke broken English and charged too much for a space barely bigger than a closet. She worked 6 days a week, cleaning offices in Manhattan before dawn, rushing to afternoon shifts, cleaning apartments on the Upper East Side. Her hands grew raw from chemicals, her back ached constantly, and every night she fell asleep wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But slowly, gradually, the city began to feel less hostile. She learned which subway cars were less crowded, which delis had the cheapest coffee, which buildings had doormen who would smile and say good morning. She started recognizing faces in her neighborhood, exchanging nods with the old man who ran the corner grocery store, waving to the mother who walked her kids to school every morning at exactly 8:15. Sarah also discovered something unexpected about herself in those early months. She was good at this work, really good at it. Not just the cleaning, though she took pride in leaving every surface spotless, every corner dust-free. She was good at reading the spaces she entered, understanding what people needed even when they weren't there to tell her. The lonely widow who left notes thanking her for arranging the family photos just so. The busy executive who always seemed calmer when Sarah made sure his morning coffee mug was waiting by the machine. The young mother who cried with relief when Sarah started folding the baby clothes and organizing the nursery without being asked. It was work that mattered, even if the world didn't always see it that way. Sarah was making people's lives better, one clean room at a time, and that gave her something she'd been searching for her whole life: purpose. 3 months into her New York adventure, Mrs. Rodriguez called with a special assignment. A penthouse on Fifth Avenue, she explained in her rapid-fire Spanish-accented English. The regular girl had quit suddenly, and they needed someone reliable, someone who could be trusted with the expensive things, someone who wouldn't gossip about what they saw. "This client, he pays very well," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But Sarah, mi amor, he is going through difficult time. His wife, she passed away a few months ago during the birth of their baby. Very sad situation. He needs someone who can be, sensitive." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She knew about loss, about the kind of grief that follows you around like a shadow. "I can handle it," she told Mrs. Rodriguez, and she meant it. The building was the kind of place Sarah had only seen in movies. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, doormen in uniforms that probably cost more than she made in a month. The elevator was a work of art, all polished brass and mahogany, and it rose so smoothly, She barely felt the movement. When the doors opened on the 20th floor, Sarah stepped into a hallway that looked like something from a magazine spread. She found the right door, used the key Mrs. Rodriguez had given her, and stepped into the most beautiful apartment she'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park that took her breath away. The furniture was elegant, but comfortable, the kind of pieces that whispered wealth without shouting it. Original artwork hung on walls painted in soft, soothing colors. This was a home built for happiness, for a family, for the kind of life Sarah had always imagined other people lived. But as she moved through the rooms, Sarah could feel the sadness that hung in the air like dust. There were signs everywhere of a life interrupted. A woman's reading glasses, still sitting on the coffee table next to a bookmark, protruding from a novel that would never be finished. A pair of high heels kicked off carelessly by the couch, as if their owner had just stepped out and would be right back. In the master bedroom, one side of the bed was still perfectly made, while the other side bore the wrinkled impression of someone who thrashed through sleepless nights. Sarah worked quietly, respectfully, moving through the living areas with practiced efficiency. She'd learned early in her career that grief had its own rhythm, and the best thing she could do was be invisible while making everything perfect. She dusted the bookshelves carefully, straightened the magazines, polished the windows until they sparkled. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 20 floors below. She was just finishing the living room when she heard it. A sound so soft at first, she thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, stronger this time. Crying. Not the crying of an adult, but something smaller, more desperate. A baby. Sarah froze, listening. Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't mentioned that anyone would be home. The crying continued, growing more urgent, more heartbreaking with each passing second. Without thinking, Sarah followed the sound down a hallway she hadn't explored yet, past what looked like a home office, past a guest room, until she reached a door that stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently and stepped into a nursery that made her heart ache with its perfection. Pale yellow walls painted with delicate butterflies, a rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light, shelves lined with books and toys, waiting for small hands to discover them. And in the center of it all, a white crib, where a baby lay crying as if her little heart was breaking. Sarah approached slowly, her cleaning supplies forgotten in the hallway. The baby couldn't be more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in distress. She was beautiful, perfect, and completely alone. "Hey there, little one," Sarah whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, it's okay. It's okay." The baby's crying faltered for a moment, as if she recognized something in Sarah's tone. Sarah looked around the room, searching for clues. There was a monitor on the dresser, its red light blinking steadily. A schedule taped to the wall showed feeding times and nap times written in careful handwriting. But there was no one here, just this tiny person who needed comfort and care. Sarah had never been particularly maternal. Growing up without stable family relationships had left her uncertain about nurturing, about the give and take of caring for someone completely dependent. But looking down at this crying baby, she felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and protective, and absolutely certain. She reached into the crib and gently lifted the baby, cradling her against her chest, the way she'd seen mothers do in movies, in television shows, in the brief glimpses of normal family life she'd observed from the outside her whole life. To her amazement, the crying stopped almost immediately. The baby settled against her, tiny body relaxing, little hiccups gradually fading into peaceful breathing. "There we go," Sarah murmured, swaying gently. "That's better, isn't it? You just needed someone to hold you." They stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Sarah holding this stranger's child, feeling more useful and needed than she had in months. The baby's weight was perfect in her arms, solid and warm and real. Sarah could smell that distinctive baby scent, sweet and clean and somehow comforting. She found herself humming softly, an old lullaby she'd heard somewhere, maybe from one of the foster mothers who'd cared for her briefly when she was small. That's when she heard the key in the front door. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be holding this man's child. How could she possibly explain this? How could she make him understand that she'd only been trying to help? The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew closer, and Sarah realized she was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. All she could do was stand there, holding this precious baby, and hope that whoever was about to walk through that door would see her intentions rather than the impossibility of the situation. The footsteps stopped just outside the nursery door. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering so loud she was sure the baby could hear it, and then the door swung open, and she found herself face to face with a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that held depths of exhaustion Sarah recognized all too well. He was wearing an expensive suit that hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight recently, and hadn't bothered to have it altered. His face was handsome in a classical way, but it was marked by grief, by sleepless nights, by the kind of pain that changes the very structure of a person's features. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, Sarah clutching his daughter, too scared to move. Him frozen in the doorway, taking in the impossible scene of a stranger comforting his child in a way he'd been struggling to do for months. The baby remained peacefully quiet between them, the only sound in the room her soft, even breathing. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "I heard her crying, and I didn't think. I know I shouldn't have—" But the man held up a hand, stopping her mid-apology. He stepped into the room slowly, as if he was afraid any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. His eyes moved from Sarah's face to his daughter's peaceful expression, and she saw something flicker across his features. Wonder, maybe, or relief. "She's been crying for hours," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Nothing I do helps. The pediatrician says she's healthy, that some babies just cry more than others, but I—" He ran a hand through his hair, and Sarah could see the tremor in his fingers. "I don't know how to be what she needs." Sarah looked down at the sleeping baby, then back at this man who was clearly drowning in grief and responsibility. "Maybe you're trying too hard," she said gently. "Sometimes they just need to feel safe." He laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Safe, right. Her mother died bringing her into this world, and I can barely keep myself together long enough to change a diaper. She probably senses that I have no idea what I'm doing." "You're here," Sarah said simply. "That's not nothing." They stood there in the soft afternoon light filtering through the nursery windows, two strangers connected by a sleeping baby and the weight of their respective loneliness. Sarah knew she should hand the baby back, should explain who she was and why she was there, should apologize again and leave them to figure out their life without her interference. But something about this moment felt too important to break, too precious to rush. "I'm David," he said finally. "David Harrison. And this is Emma." "Sarah," she replied softly. "Sarah Chen. I work for the cleaning service. I'm supposed to be here, just not like this." David nodded, but he didn't look upset or angry like Sarah had expected. Instead, he looked at his daughter's peaceful face and shook his head slowly. "I can't remember the last time she was this calm," he admitted. "What did you do?" Sarah shrugged, still swaying gently, even though Emma was sound asleep. "Nothing special, just held her. Sometimes that's enough." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew they weren't entirely true. Something had happened when she'd picked up Emma, something she couldn't quite name or explain. A connection, a recognition, as if they'd been waiting for each other without knowing it. And looking at David's face, seeing the desperate hope mixed with exhaustion and grief, Sarah realized that maybe they'd all been waiting for each other. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the Harrison apartment building, clutching her cleaning supplies and trying to understand what had happened to her overnight. She'd barely slept, replaying that moment when Emma had settled so peacefully in her arms, remembering the look in David Harrison's eyes when he'd realized his daughter was finally calm. It had been relief, yes, but something deeper too. Hope, maybe, or recognition that sometimes the help we need comes from the most unexpected places. Mrs. Rodriguez had called her at 7 a.m., her voice tight with concern. "Sarah, mi amor, I got a call from Mr. Harrison. He wants to speak with you personally before you start work today. Did something happen yesterday? Please tell me you didn't break anything expensive." But Sarah knew this wasn't about broken vases or missed dust bunnies. This was about Emma, about that inexplicable connection that had formed between them in the space of a heartbeat. As she rode the elevator up to the 20th floor, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. David answered the door before she could knock, as if he'd been waiting by the window watching for her arrival. He looked better than he had yesterday, showered and shaved, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt instead of that ill-fitting suit. But his eyes still held that bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of months without proper sleep. "Thank you for coming back," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I wasn't sure you would after yesterday." "I'm here to work," Sarah replied. But even as she said it, her eyes were drawn toward the hallway that led to Emma's nursery. "How is she? Did she sleep?" David's face transformed, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sarah saw him smile. Really smile, not the polite grimace he'd probably been wearing for months. "She slept for 6 hours straight," he said, wonder evident in his voice. 6 hours. I actually had time to shower, to eat something that wasn't cold pizza, to remember what it felt like to be human." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. "That's wonderful. Babies go through phases, though. It might not happen again tonight." "Maybe not," David agreed, but he was studying her face with an intensity that made Sarah fidget with her cleaning supplies. "But I'd like to find out. Sarah, I have a proposition for you, and I want you to hear me out before you say no." They moved into the living room, and Sarah noticed immediately that something had changed. The space still held that underlying sadness, but there was something else now, too. A sense of possibility, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. David gestured for her to sit on the couch, but Sarah remained standing, her defenses up. In her experience, when people wanted to make deals, it usually meant someone was about to get taken advantage of, and it was rarely the person with money and power. "I need help," David said simply, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Sarah was already coming to recognize as his tell for anxiety. "Not just with the cleaning, though. I need that too. I need help with Emma. My wife." He paused, swallowing hard. "Rebecca was going to take maternity leave, obviously. We had everything planned out. Nannies interviewed, pediatricians chosen, a whole support system in place. And then she—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah understood the weight of unfinished stories, of lives interrupted in the middle of chapters that were supposed to have happy endings. "I'm drowning," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love Emma more than I knew it was possible to love another human being, but I don't know how to take care of her. I don't know how to be what she needs. Yesterday, when I saw her calm in your arms, it was the first time since she was born that I thought maybe, just maybe, we might be okay." Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional quicksand she'd spent her whole life learning to avoid. Getting involved, caring too much, letting people need her. It always ended the same way, with her standing outside looking in, wondering why she'd thought this time would be different. "Mr. Harrison," she started, but he held up a hand. "David, please. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is crazy, that I'm some grieving widower who's not thinking clearly, that this is a terrible idea that will end badly for everyone involved." He looked directly at her, and Sarah saw that despite his exhaustion, despite his grief, his eyes were clear and determined. "Maybe you're right, but I watched you with my daughter yesterday, and I saw something I haven't seen in months. Peace. For both of you." "I don't know anything about taking care of babies," Sarah protested, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Something about Emma had felt natural, instinctive, as if her body had remembered skills she'd never learned. "You know more than you think," David said softly, "and you can learn the rest. I'll pay you 3 times what the cleaning service does, plus room and board if you want it. There's a guest suite on the other side of the apartment that you could have. You'd have privacy, your own space, but you'd be here when Emma needs you. When we both need you." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. 3 times her current salary would mean real money, enough to not just survive but actually save something for the future. Room and board would mean giving up that cramped room in Queens, no more hour-long subway rides, no more worrying about making rent. It was an offer that seemed too good to be true, which in Sarah's experience usually meant it was. "What about the cleaning?" she asked, grasping for practical details while her heart hammered in her chest. "You can still do that if you want to, for other clients. Or not. The choice would be yours. I just need someone here for Emma. Someone who can love her the way she deserves to be loved. The word love hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to examine too closely. Sarah thought about Emma's weight in her arms, the way the baby had settled against her as if she belonged there. She thought about David's exhausted relief, about the way this beautiful apartment felt like it was waiting for life to return to it. "This is temporary," she said finally, the words coming out firmer than she felt. "Until you find a real nanny, someone with experience and references and training." David nodded quickly. "Of course, whatever timeline makes you comfortable. And I want to keep working for Mrs. Rodriguez too, at least part-time. I don't like putting all my eggs in one basket." "Absolutely. We can work around whatever schedule you need." Sarah looked around the apartment, at the expensive furniture and artwork, at the windows that framed Central Park like a living painting. This wasn't her world, would never be her world. But Emma was in the nursery down the hall, probably waking up from her morning nap, and Sarah found herself wanting desperately to see those tiny dark eyes open and focus on her face. "Okay," she said quietly. "We can try it." The smile that spread across David's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you." The transition happened faster than Sarah had expected. Within a week, she'd moved her few belongings into the guest suite, a space larger and more luxurious than any place she'd ever lived. David had insisted on buying her new clothes appropriate for caring for a baby, had stocked the kitchen with foods she liked, had gone out of his way to make her feel welcome in what was clearly his and Rebecca's space. And Emma. Sweet, perfect Emma, who seemed to have been waiting her whole short life for Sarah to arrive. The baby thrived under Sarah's care, sleeping better, eating better, spending her waking hours alert and curious instead of crying inconsolably. Sarah found herself naturally falling into rhythms of care that felt as natural as breathing. The 2 a.m. feedings when the apartment was quiet, and it felt like they were the only two people awake in the entire city. The afternoon walks through Central Park. Emma bundled in her stroller, Sarah pointing out dogs and trees and other babies, as if Emma could understand every word. The evening baths that turned into splashing sessions that left them both soaked and laughing. Sarah had never imagined herself as maternal, but with Emma it didn't feel like playing a role. It felt like coming home to herself, discovering parts of her heart she hadn't known existed. When Emma smiled for the first time, a real smile that lit up her entire face, Sarah cried with joy. When Emma reached for her, tiny fingers grasping, Sarah felt something in her chest expand until she thought it might burst with happiness. The apartment itself began to change too. Where before it had felt like a museum to interrupted dreams, now it pulsed with life. Emma's toys scattered across the living room floor, her bouncy seat positioned to catch the morning light, her high chair pulled up to the dining room table. The sounds of daily life replaced the oppressive silence, Emma's babbling, Sarah's off-key singing, the rattle of toys, the hum of the baby monitor. David watched it all with something approaching amazement. He'd throw himself into work during the day, but he always came home for lunch to check on them, and Sarah began to look forward to those midday visits. He'd sit on the floor with Emma, making ridiculous faces that sent her into peals of delighted laughter, or he'd help Sarah with feeding time. The three of them crowded around the high chair like a real family. "You should go back to school," David said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. It had become their routine, the two of them working together while Emma played in her bouncy seat, gurgling happily at the ceiling fan that fascinated her endlessly. Sarah looked up from loading the dishwasher, surprised. "What? School? College? You're smart, Sarah. Anyone can see that. What did you want to study before life got in the way?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn. She'd never told him about her dreams, about the plans she'd had to major in elementary education, before money became an issue, before survival became more important than ambition. "How did you read to Emma differently than most people would," David said, settling into the chair across from her. "You don't just recite the words, you perform them. You make the voices come alive. And the way you organize her toys, her clothes, everything. It's not just neat, it's educational. You're teaching her even when you don't realize it." Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I like kids. I always have." "Then why not make it official? Get your degree, become a teacher. I could help with tuition, work around your class schedule." "David," Sarah started to protest, but he held up a hand. "I'm not trying to control your life or make you dependent on me," he said seriously. "I'm trying to invest in someone who's already invested so much in us. You've given Emma stability, happiness, love. Let me give you the chance to build the future you deserve." That night, Sarah lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, David's words echoing in her mind. The guest suite was beautiful, decorated in soft blues and greys, with windows that looked out over the city lights. She had her own bathroom, her own sitting area, her own space to retreat to when the weight of living in someone else's life became too much. But lately, she found herself spending less and less time in this room, drawn instead to the common areas where David and Emma were, where life was happening. She'd applied to NYU the next day, her heart hammering as she filled out the online application for their elementary education program. When the acceptance letter came 3 weeks later, she'd stared at it for so long the words had blurred together. David had found her crying at the kitchen table, Emma on her lap, the letter spread out in front of them. "Happy tears?" he'd asked gently, sitting down across from her. "I don't know what kind of tears," Sarah had admitted. "I never thought, I hoped, but I never really believed it would happen." David had reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the first time he'd touched her deliberately, purposefully. His palm was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked with his mind but hadn't forgotten how to work with his body. "It's happening," he'd said softly. "You're making it happen." The months that followed were a blur of classes and homework and late-night study sessions, while Emma slept peacefully in her crib. Sarah had worried that adding school to her responsibilities would be too much, but instead it energized her. She was learning about child development, about educational psychology, about the ways children's minds worked and grew. Everything she was studying she could apply immediately with Emma, turning their daily routines into learning opportunities. David had been incredibly supportive, taking over Emma's care during Sarah's evening classes, helping with homework when she got stuck on particularly challenging concepts, celebrating her good grades as if they were his own achievements. They'd fallen into an easy partnership, a comfortable rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, but somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Sarah began to notice the way David's face lit up when he came home, and found her and Emma playing on the living room floor. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression soft and wondering, as if he was seeing something that surprised him. During Emma's nap times, they'd begun talking, really talking, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Sarah learned that David was an architect, that he'd designed this very apartment as a surprise for Rebecca when they'd gotten married. She learned that he'd grown up in Connecticut, the youngest of 3 boys, in the kind of stable, loving family Sarah had only read about in books. She learned that he played piano, that he made terrible coffee but excellent pancakes, that he'd wanted to be a father since he was old enough to understand what fathers did. David learned that Sarah had been reading since she was 4, that she'd taught herself French and Spanish from library books, that she could remember every foster family she'd ever lived with, but couldn't remember her biological mother's voice. He learned that she was afraid of thunderstorms but loved the rain, that she could make Emma laugh with nothing but funny faces and sound effects, that she was stronger and more resilient than anyone he'd ever known. They were becoming friends, real friends, in a way that felt both comfortable and dangerous, because underneath the friendship, underneath the easy partnership and shared responsibility for Emma, something else was growing, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge, let alone act upon. It came to a head on a Thursday night in late September. A thunderstorm had been building all day, the apartment growing darker and more oppressive as the afternoon wore on. Emma had been fussy, picking up on the atmospheric pressure the way babies do, and Sarah had spent most of the day trying to keep her calm and distracted. David had come home early, finding Sarah on the couch with Emma, both of them looking frazzled. "Rough day?" he'd asked, and Sarah had just nodded, too tired to pretend everything was fine. He'd taken over then, handling Emma's evening routine while Sarah retreated to her room to study for a midterm exam. But the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke just after 10 o'clock, arriving with the kind of violent intensity that shook the windows and made the lights flicker. Sarah was in the kitchen making tea when the first crack of thunder split the air. She jumped, her heart immediately racing, the familiar panic rising in her chest. She'd been afraid of storms since she was small, a fear that made no rational sense, but was as much a part of her as her eye color or her height. "Sarah?" David appeared in the doorway, concern written across his face. "Are you okay?" She nodded quickly, trying to hide the tremor in her hands as she reached for her mug. "Fine, just don't love storms." Another crash of thunder, louder this time, and Sarah couldn't stop herself from flinching. David stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring in a way that made her want to lean into him. "Want some company?" he asked softly. They ended up on the couch together, sharing a blanket, drinking tea and talking quietly, while the storm raged outside. Emma slept peacefully through it all, her baby monitor crackling occasionally with the soft sounds of her dreams. Sarah found herself relaxing despite the thunder, David's steady presence anchoring her in a way she'd never experienced before. "Thank you," she said during a quiet moment between thunderclaps, "for everything. For trusting me with Emma, for supporting my education, for making me feel like I belong somewhere." David turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the living room, his eyes were dark and serious. "You do belong here, Sarah. I can't imagine our lives without you anymore." The air between them shifted, charged with something that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Sarah felt her breath catch as David reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "David," she whispered, but she didn't know if she was warning him or encouraging him. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know the timing is terrible, that I'm still grieving, that this could ruin everything we've built together. But Sarah, He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he leaned forward and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Sarah kissed him back. It was a kiss full of longing and uncertainty, of months of unspoken feelings finally finding their voice. Sarah felt herself melting into him, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. David rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his hands still cupping her face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," Sarah said firmly. "Don't apologize. Not for that." But even as she said it, she could see the conflict in his eyes, the guilt that was already creeping in. Rebecca's ghost was still here, still part of this apartment, this life. And Sarah, despite the way her heart was singing, knew that one kiss didn't solve anything. If anything, it had made everything infinitely more complicated. The morning after the storm brought the kind of awkward silence that settles over people who've crossed a line they can't uncross. Sarah woke up in her own bed, but she could still feel the phantom pressure of David's lips on hers, could still remember the way her heart had stopped and started again in the space between one breath and the next. She lay there listening to Emma's morning babbling through the baby monitor, trying to figure out how to face David across the breakfast table, how to pretend that everything was normal when her entire world had shifted on its axis. When she finally worked up the courage to venture into the kitchen, she found a note on the counter next to a fresh pot of coffee. David's handwriting was careful, measured, the writing of someone who'd thought long and hard about every word. "Sarah, had to leave early for a client meeting. Thank you for last night, for everything, always. We should talk when I get home. David." She read the note 3 times, searching for clues about his state of mind, about whether he was regretting what had happened between them or planning to repeat it. The formality of his tone worried her. In the months they'd been living together, sharing Emma's care, building something that felt remarkably like a family, David had never been formal with her. Even in those first uncertain weeks, there had been an easy warmth between them, a natural comfort that had made their unusual arrangement work. Emma, blissfully unaware of the adult complications swirling around her, was in full charming mode that morning. She'd started pulling herself up to standing, using the coffee table and couch cushions as leverage, and she was incredibly proud of this new skill. Sarah spent the morning following her around the apartment, making sure she didn't topple over, marveling at how quickly babies learned, how fearlessly they approached each new challenge. "What do you think, little bird?" Sarah asked as Emma practiced her standing skills, tiny hands gripping the edge of the coffee table with fierce determination. "Did I mess everything up last night?" Emma looked at her with those serious dark eyes and babbled something that sounded remarkably like judgment. Sarah laughed despite her anxiety, scooping the baby up for a cuddle. This, at least, was uncomplicated. Emma's love was pure, unconditional, without the messy emotional baggage that made adult relationships feel like walking through a minefield. The day crawled by with painful slowness. Sarah attended her morning classes at NYU, but she couldn't concentrate on the lecture about developmental milestones, her mind replaying the kiss over and over. She picked up Emma from the babysitter David had arranged for her class days, spent the afternoon in Central Park, trying to exhaust them both, hoping that physical tiredness might quiet the restless energy that had been building in her chest all day. David came home just as Sarah was giving Emma her evening bath, and she heard him moving around the apartment, the familiar sounds of him arriving home from work. Keys hitting the bowl by the front door, briefcase set down with a soft thud, the rustle of mail being sorted. Normal sounds, routine sounds, but tonight they made Sarah's stomach clench with nerves. "We're in here," she called out, trying to keep her voice light and casual. Emma was in full splash mode, delighted with the way the water moved when she slapped it with her palms, soaking the front of Sarah's shirt in the process. David appeared in the doorway, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He'd loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept about as well as Sarah had. But when he saw Emma's wet, happy face, his expression softened into genuine smile. "How are my girls?" he asked, and then immediately flushed as if the possessive phrase had slipped out without his permission. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she focused on Emma, lifting her out of the bath and wrapping her in a fluffy towel. "Someone learned to pull herself up to standing today," she said, grateful for the distraction of Emma's achievement. "She's very proud of herself. Is that right?" David moved closer, helping to dry Emma's tiny feet, his hands brushing Sarah's in the process. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent electricity shooting up Sarah's arms. Such a big girl. They got Emma into her pajamas and settled for her bedtime story. The three of them crowded into the rocking chair in the nursery like they'd done dozens of times before. But tonight, every accidental touch felt loaded with meaning, every shared glance charged with the memory of that kiss. Emma, sensing the tension between the adults, was fussier than usual, fighting sleep with the determination of someone who knew she was missing out on something important. "She knows," David said quietly, as they finally got Emma settled in her crib, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. "Knows what? That something's changed between us." David's voice was soft, but there was something underneath it that made Sarah's stomach tighten with dread. Babies are intuitive about that kind of thing. They left Emma's room and walked to the living room in silence, both of them moving carefully as if the wrong word or gesture might shatter something precious and irreplaceable. Sarah sat on one end of the couch, David on the other, and the space between them felt like an ocean. "Sarah," David began, then stopped, running his hands through his hair in that gesture she'd come to recognize as his tell for deep anxiety. "About last night. You regret it," Sarah said quietly, not a question but a statement. She'd been preparing herself for this conversation all day, but it still hit her like a physical blow. "No," David said quickly, then caught himself. "Yes, I don't know." He looked at her with eyes full of pain and confusion. "I can't regret something that felt that right, but I also can't pretend it wasn't complicated. Wrong maybe in ways I don't know how to untangle." Sarah felt tears prick the backs of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She'd learned long ago not to cry when people were explaining why they couldn't keep her, why she didn't fit, why she was too much trouble or too little reward. "Rebecca," she said simply, because sometimes the hardest truths needed to be spoken out loud. David nodded, his face crumpling slightly. "I loved her so much, Sarah. We were married for 5 years, together for 7, and I thought I'd spend the rest of my life loving her. When she died, when I lost her, I felt like someone had torn half my soul away. I never thought I'd feel anything for anyone else again." "But you do," Sarah said softly. "But I do," David agreed, his voice barely a whisper. "And I don't know what that makes me. A terrible husband? A man who's betraying his wife's memory? Someone who's so desperate for companionship that he'd risk the best thing that's happened to Emma since she was born?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "Is that what you think this is? Desperation?" "I don't know what this is," David said honestly. "I know that you're amazing with Emma, that you've brought life back into this apartment, that you make me laugh for the first time since Rebecca died. I know that when I see you holding my daughter, Something in my chest gets so tight I can barely breathe. I know that kissing you felt like coming back to life after being dead for months. But, David looked at her with eyes full of regret, but I also know that the timing is terrible, that I'm still grieving, that you deserve better than someone who's trying to figure out how to love again while still mourning the love he lost. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the windows that looked out over Central Park. The city lights twinkled below them, millions of people living their lives, falling in love, having their hearts broken, trying to figure out how to keep going when everything fell apart. "What do you want me to do, David?" she asked without turning around. "Do you want me to pretend it didn't happen? Do you want me to leave? Find somewhere else to live? Let you hire a real nanny who won't complicate your life?" "No," David said immediately, and the panic in his voice made Sarah turn around. "God, no. Sarah, you can't leave. Emma needs you. I need you. Just... Can we take this slow? Can we figure out what this is without rushing into something that might hurt all of us?" Sarah studied his face, seeing the genuine fear there, the love for his daughter that trumped everything else, including his own needs. She thought about Emma sleeping peacefully down the hall, about the life they'd built together over the past months, about how much she'd grown to love both of them. "Okay," she said finally. "Slow. We can do slow." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that slow was going to be torture. How do you live with someone you're falling in love with, care for his child like she's your own, share quiet dinners and late-night conversations, and pretend that every accidental touch doesn't set your heart racing? How do you be patient with grief that isn't yours, with a dead woman's claim on the man you're starting to love? The weeks that followed were an exercise in restraint that left them both emotionally exhausted. They were scrupulously careful around each other, maintaining appropriate distance, avoiding the kind of intimate moments that had led to that kiss. But the careful politeness was almost worse than the tension had been. David started working later, spending more time at the office, and when he was home, he threw himself into caring for Emma with an intensity that felt almost desperate. Sarah threw herself into her studies, spending hours hunched over textbooks and lesson plans, as if academic success could fill the growing hollow space in her chest. She was doing well in her classes, had even caught the attention of a professor who was encouraging her to consider graduate school, but the achievements felt empty without David there to share them with. Emma, caught between two adults who were trying so hard not to hurt each other that they were hurting themselves, became increasingly fussy and demanding. She'd started waking up in the middle of the night, crying for no apparent reason, and both Sarah and David would rush to comfort her, their hands brushing as they reached for the same toy, their bodies pressing close in the small space of the nursery. It was during one of these middle-of-the-night vigils that everything changed. Emma had been particularly difficult, crying inconsolably for over an hour, despite every soothing technique they tried. Finally, around 3 a.m., she'd exhausted herself into sleep, and David and Sarah found themselves in the living room, both too wound up to go back to bed. "I should organize Rebecca's things," David said suddenly, staring at the closed door of what had been his and Rebecca's bedroom. Sarah had never been inside that room, had respected David's need to keep that space private. "I keep saying I'll do it, but I never... It feels too final, I guess." "You don't have to," Sarah said quietly. "Not until you're ready." "I think I might be ready," David replied, but his voice was uncertain. "Emma's going to start walking soon, start getting into everything. I should turn Rebecca's office into a proper playroom, but first I need to go through her things, decide what to keep, what to..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of comfort that had become safe between them. "I could help," she offered, "if you want. Sometimes it's easier with someone else there." David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that." They decided to start with Rebecca's home office, a small room off the master bedroom that had been her private space. Sarah had only glimpsed it in passing, but she'd noticed the built-in bookshelves, the antique desk positioned to catch the morning light, the photographs of Rebecca and David scattered throughout their relationship. The room felt sacred somehow, like they were intruding on someone's private thoughts. Rebecca's presence was everywhere, in the coffee mug still sitting on the desk with a ring of ancient coffee stain, in the half-finished crossword puzzle folded next to her computer, in the sweater draped over the back of her chair, as if she'd just stepped out and would be right back. David moved through the space like he was walking through a minefield, touching things gingerly, his face cycling through grief and memory, and something that looked almost like guilt. Sarah tried to be helpful without being intrusive, boxing up books, sorting through papers that looked like they could be thrown away. It was while she was organizing a stack of files that she found it. The envelope was tucked between two folders, as if it had been hidden there deliberately. Sarah almost missed it, but something about the way it was positioned, the deliberate concealment of it, caught her attention. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize, but the envelope was unsealed, the flap tucked inside rather than glued down. Sarah stared at the envelope, her heart beginning to race. This felt important, dangerous, like something she shouldn't be seeing, but her name was on it, written in someone else's hand, and curiosity won out over caution. She pulled out the letter and unfolded it, scanning the first few lines with growing shock and horror. It was dated just 2 months before Emma was born, written in the same handwriting as the envelope. "My dearest David," it began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I'm not brave enough to tell you this truth while I'm still alive to see the pain it will cause you." Sarah's hands began to tremble as she continued reading. "I've been having an affair. It started 6 months ago with James from my office, and it continued even after I found out I was pregnant. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a mistake. But the truth is, I don't know if Emma is your daughter or his. I've been living with this terrible secret, this awful doubt, and I can't bear the thought of you raising another man's child thinking she's yours." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the words sank in. She looked across the room where David was carefully packing Rebecca's jewelry, his movements slow and reverent, and she felt her heart break for what this revelation would do to him. The letter continued. "I know I should tell you, should give you the choice about what to do with this information, but I'm terrified of losing you, of destroying the life we've built together. I love you so much, David, more than I ever loved James, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. But I also love this baby, regardless of who her father is, and I want her to have the kind of father I know you'll be." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly now, she could barely hold the paper steady. The final paragraph was the worst. "I'm going to take this secret to my grave, but I couldn't bear the thought of you never knowing the truth. If something happens to me, if you find this letter, please know that I'm sorry. Sorry for betraying you, sorry for the doubt I've put in your heart, sorry for being too much of a coward to tell you face to face. Emma deserves a father who loves her completely, and I know that's you, blood or no blood. Please forgive me. Please forgive us both. All my love, Rebecca." Sarah stared at the letter until the words blurred together, her mind struggling to process what she'd just read. David's wife had been cheating on him. Emma might not be his biological daughter. All these months of David torturing himself with guilt over moving forward, over finding love again, and Rebecca had been keeping this devastating secret. "Find anything interesting?" Sarah jumped, spinning around to find David standing right behind her, his arms full of photograph albums. He must have seen something in her expression because his smile faded immediately. "Sarah? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah looked down at the letter in her hands, then back at David's concerned face, and felt the weight of an impossible choice settle on her shoulders. She could pretend she hadn't found it, could slip it back between the folders, and let David continue believing in the perfect marriage he'd been mourning. Or she could hand him this piece of paper that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his wife, his grief, his daughter, himself. Sarah started, then stopped, the words caught in her throat. David stepped closer, setting down the photo albums, his eyes never leaving her face. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What is it?" With trembling hands, Sarah held out the letter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, David." David took the letter, confusion written across his features as he began to read. Sarah watched his face change, watched confusion give way to shock, shock give way to pain, pain give way to something that looked like the complete destruction of everything he'd believed about his life. He read the letter twice, his lips moving slightly as he processed the words, and then he crumpled it in his fist, his face going completely white. "No," he said quietly. "No, this isn't. Rebecca wouldn't." But even as he said it, Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the terrible questions beginning to form. How many late nights at the office had Rebecca claimed? How many business trips? How many times had she been distant, distracted, guilty about something she couldn't name? David sat down heavily in Rebecca's desk chair, the letter still crumpled in his fist, and stared at nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the terrible implications of what they'd just learned. "Emma," David said finally, his voice so quiet Sarah had to strain to hear it. "David, it doesn't matter," Sarah said quickly, moving to kneel beside his chair. "Emma is your daughter. You've loved her, cared for her, been her father from the moment she was born. Biology doesn't change that." But David was shaking his head, his eyes wide with a kind of panicked desperation. "I need to know," he said. "I have to know for sure. I can't live with this doubt, with wondering every time I look at her, whether she's really mine." "She is yours," Sarah insisted. "In every way that matters, she's yours." David looked at her with eyes full of anguish. "But what if she's not? What if I've been living a lie for the past year? What if everything I've felt, everything I've believed about Rebecca, about our marriage, about Emma, what if none of it was real?" Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "Your love for Emma is real. That's the only thing that matters." But David was already pulling out his phone, already looking up genetic testing laboratories, already spiraling into the kind of obsessive need for certainty that Sarah recognized from her own darkest moments. When you've built your life on what you thought was solid ground, discovering it might be quicksand makes you desperate to find something, anything, you can trust completely. "I need some space," David said without looking at her. "I need to think, to process this, to figure out what this means." Sarah felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest. Space. In her experience, when people said they needed space, what they really meant was that they needed space from her specifically, that she'd become too much trouble, too complicated, too painful to keep around. "How much space?" she asked quietly. David finally looked at her, and she saw her fears confirmed in his eyes. I think maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while, just until I can sort this out, figure out what I'm going to do." Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow. "David, please, don't do this. Emma needs me. You need me." "I can't think straight with you here," David said, his voice breaking. "I can't figure out what I'm feeling about Rebecca, about Emma, about you, about any of this when you're right here being perfect and understanding and everything she apparently wasn't." "I'm not perfect," Sarah protested. "I'm just someone who loves you and Emma and wants to help." "That's the problem," David said quietly. "I can't trust my own feelings right now. I don't know if what I feel for you is real or if you're just convenient, available. The opposite of everything Rebecca turned out to be." Sarah felt something inside her chest shatter completely. After everything they'd built together, after all the ways she'd proven her love for him and Emma, he still saw her as a convenience, a replacement, a consolation prize for a man whose real life had been destroyed by his wife's betrayal. "Fine," Sarah said, standing up and wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I'll pack my things." "Sarah, please don't," David started, but she was already walking away. "No," she said without turning around. "You're right. You need space to figure out what's real and what's just convenient. I'll make it easy for you." Sarah packed her belongings with mechanical efficiency, her mind going numb to protect her from the full weight of what was happening. 3 hours later, she was standing in the hallway outside the apartment that had become home, her few possessions in the same duffel bag and backpack she'd arrived with almost a year ago. David had offered to help her find a place, had tried to give her money for a hotel, but Sarah had refused everything. She couldn't take his charity, couldn't let him ease his guilt by taking care of her. She was back where she'd started, alone, homeless, with nothing but her own determination to keep her going. The last thing she heard as the elevator doors closed was Emma crying, that heartbroken wail she hadn't heard since those early days when nothing could comfort her. Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about Emma waking up tomorrow to find her gone, tried not to imagine the confusion and abandonment the baby would feel when the woman who'd become her mother figure simply vanished from her life. As the elevator descended, carrying her away from the only real family she'd ever known, Sarah made herself a promise. She would survive this. The way she'd survived every other abandonment, every other loss. She would build a new life, finish her degree, become the teacher she'd always dreamed of being, but she would never, ever let herself believe in families again. Some lessons she was learning had to be taught more than once before they really stuck. Sarah had been gone for exactly 72 hours when David realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Emma hadn't stopped crying. Not really, not completely. She would exhaust herself into brief periods of sleep, but she'd wake up looking around with those dark eyes full of confusion and loss, as if she was searching for someone who would never come back. She refused most of her bottles, picked at her food, and even her favorite toys couldn't hold her attention for more than a few minutes at a time. David hired a temporary nanny, a kind older woman named Mrs. Peterson, who came with glowing references and decades of experience. But Emma wanted nothing to do with her, arching her back and screaming whenever Mrs. Peterson tried to pick her up, reaching her tiny arms toward the door, as if she could somehow will Sarah back through sheer determination. "She's grieving," Mrs. Peterson told David on the second day, her face full of professional sympathy. "Babies form deep attachments, and when those attachments are broken suddenly, they mourn just like adults do. Only they don't understand why the person they love has disappeared." David sat in his office, staring at the genetic testing kit he'd ordered online, and felt like the worst kind of monster. What had he done? In his panic and pain over Rebecca's betrayal, he'd thrown away the best thing that had happened to either him or Emma since she was born. He'd sent away the woman who had brought love and laughter back into their home, who had made Emma feel safe and cherished, who had made him remember what it felt like to hope for the future. The DNA results came back on Thursday morning, delivered in a plain white envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. David stared at it for an hour before finding the courage to open it, his hands shaking as he unfolded the official document inside. The results were conclusive. He was Emma's biological father, with 99.9% certainty. David should have felt relief, vindication, some kind of resolution to the terrible doubt that had been eating away at him. Instead, he felt empty, hollow, because he'd realized somewhere in the dark hours of Emma's inconsolable crying that it didn't matter. Blood or no blood, Emma was his daughter. She'd been his daughter from the moment he'd first held her tiny, perfect body in the hospital. She'd been his daughter through every sleepless night, every milestone, every moment of joy and terror that came with loving someone more than your own life. And Sarah. God, Sarah had tried to tell him that, had begged him to see that love was what made a family, not genetics. And he'd been too blinded by hurt and betrayal to hear her. "I'm an idiot," he told Emma that evening as she cried in his arms, her little body rigid with the kind of grief that has no words. "I'm the biggest idiot in the world, and I hurt the person who loves you most. I hurt the person who loves us both most." Emma looked up at him with eyes so much like his own, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, and David felt his heart break all over again. But this time, it wasn't breaking from betrayal or doubt. It was breaking from the terrible recognition of what he'd thrown away. He found Sarah's address through NYU's student directory, then spent another day working up the courage to go see her. When he finally stood outside the rundown building in Queens, where she was renting a room again, David felt like he was about to face the most important conversation of his life. The woman who answered Sarah's knock on the door was different from the one who had left his apartment 4 days earlier. She was thinner, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but there was something else too. A hardness that hadn't been there before, a wall that had gone up between her heart and the world. "David." Her voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "How did you find me?" "The school directory, Sarah, please, I need to talk to you, I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain," Sarah said, but she stepped aside to let him into the tiny room that was somehow even smaller and more depressing than the place she'd lived when she first came to New York. "You needed space to figure things out. I gave you space." "I was wrong," David said immediately. "About everything, about the test, about needing space, about what matters and what doesn't. Sarah, I was so hurt by Rebecca's letter, so angry and confused that I couldn't think straight, but Emma—" His voice broke and Sarah's carefully constructed mask slipped just a little. "How is she?" Sarah asked quietly. "Heartbroken. She cries constantly, won't eat properly, won't sleep. She knows you're gone and she doesn't understand why." David stepped closer, encouraged by the pain he saw in Sarah's eyes, the evidence that she was hurting too. "The nanny I hired says she's grieving. That babies mourn just like adults when someone they love disappears from their lives." Sarah pressed her lips together, and David could see her fighting back tears. "She'll adjust. Children are resilient." "Are they?" David challenged gently. "Are you?" Because you look like you haven't slept in days. I'm fine, Sarah said, but her voice wavered. No, you're not. Neither am I. Neither is Emma. We're all falling apart without you, Sarah, because you're not just someone who takes care of us, you're family. You're the heart of our family. Sarah shook her head, backing away from him. Don't do this. You made your choice when you decided I was just convenient, just a replacement for what Rebecca turned out not to be. I was wrong about that too, David said desperately. Sarah, the DNA test came back. Emma is my biological daughter. But you know what? The moment I saw those results, I realized they didn't matter. They never mattered. Emma was always mine, and more importantly, she was always yours too. From that first day when you held her and she stopped crying, you became her mother in every way that counts. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, but she was still shaking her head. You can't just take that back. You can't just decide you made a mistake and expect everything to go back to normal. You're right, David said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. I can't take it back and I can't expect you to forgive me. But I can promise you that if you give us another chance, I will never, ever doubt what we have again. I can promise you that you'll never just be convenient or temporary or second best to anyone. You'll be my partner, my equal, Emma's mother in every legal and emotional sense. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and David held his breath, waiting for her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, resolved. If we do this, if we try again, things have to be different. No more making decisions about our family without including me. No more pushing me away when things get complicated. We're either partners in this, true partners, or we're nothing. Partners, David agreed immediately. In everything, always. Sarah studied his face, searching for sincerity, for the promise of something real and lasting. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she stepped forward and let him pull her into his arms. They went home together, and when Emma saw Sarah walk through the front door, her face lit up like Christmas morning. She babbled excitedly, reaching for Sarah with both arms, and when Sarah scooped her up and covered her face with kisses, Emma laughed with pure joy. The sound filled the apartment, chasing away the sadness that had settled over everything like dust. I missed you too, little bird, Sarah whispered against Emma's hair. I missed you so much. That night, after Emma was peacefully asleep and they'd talked through everything that had happened, all the hurt and fear and misunderstandings, David asked Sarah to marry him, not with a ring or grand gestures, but with simple, honest words. I love you, he said as they sat on the couch, Emma's baby monitor crackling softly between them. I love you for who you are, not because you take care of Emma, not because you fill some void Rebecca left. I love your strength, your kindness, your terrible singing voice, your fierce determination to build a better life. I love the way you make Emma laugh, the way you make me want to be a better man. Marry me, Sarah. Let's make this official, legal, permanent. Sarah looked at him with eyes full of tears and love and hope. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. They decided to leave New York. The city that had brought them together felt too crowded with memories, too full of ghosts and complicated history. David could work from anywhere, and Sarah could transfer to finish her teaching degree. They found a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where Emma could grow up with space to run and clean air to breathe. They bought a house with good bones and big windows, spent months fixing it up while Emma crawled around the construction site, getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a baby who felt completely secure in her parents' love. They planned to open a small private school, the kind of place that focused on nurturing the whole child, on building confidence and creativity along with academic skills. The DNA test results, when David finally threw them away, felt like shedding the last chains of a painful past. Emma was theirs, they were hers, and that was the only truth that mattered. They were married in their backyard on a crisp October morning, with Emma toddling between them in a white dress that made her look like a tiny angel. It was small and simple and perfect, with just a few close friends and the justice of the peace who lived down the road. Sarah wore her grandmother's ring, the only thing she'd kept from her childhood, and when David slipped it onto her finger, she felt like she was finally, truly home. The school opened the following September, 6 bright classrooms in a converted farmhouse, with a playground that David had built himself, and a garden where the children could learn about growing things. They called it New Beginnings Academy, and their philosophy was simple. Every child deserved to feel loved, valued, and capable of achieving anything they could dream. Emma was 2 by then, a bright, curious little girl who chatted constantly and charmed everyone she met. She called Sarah Mama and David Daddy, with the absolute certainty of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. Watching her play with the other children, Sarah often marveled at how perfectly everything had worked out, how all their struggles had led them to exactly where they were supposed to be. They'd been blissfully happy for almost a year when the phone call came. Sarah was in the kitchen making lunch when David answered, his voice cheerful as he always was these days. "Harrison residence." But his tone changed quickly, became serious, concerned. Sarah looked up from Emma's sandwich to see David's face go pale, his free hand gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" David said, his voice strange and tight. "You're saying what exactly?" Sarah moved closer, dread building in her chest as she watched David's expression cycle through confusion, shock, and something that looked like terror. "Yes," David said finally. "Yes, I understand. We'll be there as soon as we can." He hung up the phone and stood staring at it for a long moment, as if he could make the conversation he'd just had unhappen through sheer force of will. "David?" Sarah said quietly. "What is it? What's wrong?" David turned to look at her, his face ashen. "That was Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. Sarah, there might have been a mix-up with the babies. When Emma was born." The sandwich Sarah had been making fell from her numb fingers. "What kind of mix-up?" "A woman called the hospital yesterday. Her daughter was born the same day as Emma, same time, same unit. The little girl is sick, very sick. She needs a bone marrow transplant and—" David's voice cracked. "And when they tested the family members for compatibility, they discovered that the father isn't biologically related to the child they've been raising." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. "You're saying—" "I'm saying there might have been a switch, that Emma might not be, that the baby we've been raising might not be the baby Rebecca gave birth to." David looked at Emma, who was playing happily with her blocks, completely unaware that her entire world might be about to change again. "They want us to come in for testing." "All of us." Sarah sank into a chair, her mind struggling to process what David was telling her. Her Emma, the baby she'd fallen in love with at first sight, might not be the child she'd thought she was. Somewhere out there might be another little girl, sick and in need of help, who was their biological daughter, and the healthy, happy toddler playing at their feet might belong to another family entirely. "No," Sarah said firmly. "No, I don't care what the tests say. Emma is our daughter. We're not giving her up, not for anything. Sarah, if the other child is really ours, then we'll help her however we can. But Emma stays with us. We've loved her, raised her, been her parents for every day of her life. Biology doesn't change that." David looked at his wife, this fierce woman who had taught him the true meaning of family, and felt his heart swell with love and admiration. "You're right. Whatever we find out, Emma is ours. Nothing changes that." The tests confirmed their worst fears. Emma was not biologically related to either of them. The other child, a little girl named Sophie, who was fighting a rare blood disorder, was David's biological daughter. And Emma's biological parents were the couple who had been frantically searching for a bone marrow donor for the child they'd been raising. The revelation could have destroyed them, could have led to custody battles, to families torn apart, to children shuffled between parents like possessions instead of people. But Sarah and David, along with Sophie's parents Mark and Jennifer, made a different choice. They chose love over biology, connection over genetics, the families they'd built over the ones science said they should have. David donated bone marrow to save Sophie, the biological daughter he'd never known. Sarah spent days at the hospital, holding Emma while Sophie recovered, letting the 2 little girls get to know each other gradually, gently. And slowly, impossibly, beautifully, 2 families became one extended family. Sophie recovered fully. Emma gained a sister who shared her dark eyes and stubborn chin, and 4 adults learned that the heart has infinite capacity for love when you let it. They didn't switch the children back. How could they? Emma belonged with Sarah and David, the only parents she'd ever known. Sophie belonged with Mark and Jennifer, who had loved her through every day of her illness and recovery. But the girls spent weekends together, holidays together, grew up as sisters in the truest sense of the word. On Emma's 5th birthday, as Sarah watched her daughter blow out the candles surrounded by both her families, she marveled at the journey that had brought them all together. A young woman from Iowa looking for a fresh start, a grieving widower who didn't know how to be a father, a crying baby who needed love, a terrible secret that had nearly destroyed them, a mix-up at a hospital that could have torn them apart, but instead made their family twice as large and infinitely more precious. "What did you wish for, little bird?" Sarah asked as Emma carefully extracted the candles from her cake. Emma looked up with eyes that sparkled with mischief and joy. "I wished for our family to be happy forever and ever," she announced solemnly. Sarah looked around the room at David, who was teaching Sophie how to play piano, at Mark and Jennifer, who had become some of their closest friends, at their 2 daughters, biological strangers who had become each other's best friends and confidants, at the life they'd all built together, complicated and unconventional and absolutely perfect. "I think that wish is going to come true," Sarah told Emma, pulling her onto her lap for a hug. Later that night, after both girls were asleep and the last of the birthday guests had gone home, Sarah and David sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance in their garden. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" David asked, his arm tightened around Sarah's shoulders. "If you hadn't taken that cleaning job, if Emma hadn't been crying that day, if we'd let fear keep us apart instead of fighting for what we had." Sarah snuggled deeper into his embrace, thinking about all the what-ifs and might-have-beens that could have led them down different paths. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember that some things are just meant to be. Emma was meant to be our daughter, whether biology agrees or not. Sophie was meant to find her way to health and happiness. We were all meant to find each other and build this beautiful, crazy, mixed-up family." "You really believe that?" David asked. "That some things are destined?" Sarah looked through the window at Emma's room, where their daughter slept peacefully, surrounded by pictures of all the people who loved her. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the pain and loss and desperate hope that had led to this moment of perfect contentment. "I believe in love," she said simply. "I believe that when you choose to love someone completely, unconditionally, it creates something real and lasting and unbreakable. Emma chose us. We chose her, and that choice matters more than any DNA test or birth certificate ever could." David pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, marveling at how lucky he was to have found this woman, this life, this family that had grown from the ashes of loss into something more beautiful than anything he'd dared to dream. "I love you, Sarah Harrison," he murmured against her hair. "I love you too," she replied, the words as true and certain as her own heartbeat. Above them, the stars wheeled through the Vermont sky, and inside their house, 2 little girls dreamed the dreams of children who had never doubted they were cherished, protected, and deeply loved.